Hello there. It's time for Most Things Kenobi. Shouldn't it be All Things Kenobi?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Most Things Kenobi, a podcast about Obi-Wan Kenobi and all things Star Wars. I'm your host, Lauren.
And I'm your host, Leanne.
And this week, we are talking about something called the New Hollywood Era. And Leanne, you are being very kind to talk about this with me.
Well, okay. So I'm going to be the inquisitive co-host who knows little to nothing. And Lauren's going to educate me and the listeners, which I do. The way you describe this is very fascinating. I think I can add a few things because we kind of had like a little preamble before we started recording.
Yeah.
So I won't be totally useless, but you are the knowledgeable person in this conversation tonight.
I'm finally going to get to use my college degree.
Every time you talk about cinematography or music or shots, angles, this, that, the other thing, I just sit over here. I'm like, she's so smart.
Well, that's how I feel when you explain science to me.
Oh, God. Well, that's for another episode because this is not it. This is all you, my dear.
The thing that's nice about this is everyone has seen movies. Everyone, well, most Americans, I won't say everybody, but most Americans have a sense of American history. So everyone can relate to this. I'm just going to give general overviews. I won't dive too crazy deep into anything, but the New Hollywood movement was like, it was a big deal in cinema, and it was the turning point for a lot of cinema. And George Lucas was right in the middle of it. And that's why I want to talk about it.
I was going to say, you said this started in the 70s, right?
It's technically like mid-60s to about 1980-ish.
Oh, okay.
Some people say it's just the 60s. Some people say just 60s and 70s. Some say it goes into the 80s a little bit. So eras in cinema have blurry edges. There's no like hard line on it. There's a lot of overlap. New stuff begins as the old stuff is still going. But the main New Hollywood directors are all people you know. It's George Lucas, it's Spielberg, it's Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese. You know, they changed the face of cinema. And a lot of other ones, like, you know, there's quite a few other ones, but those are the most, I would say the most average person is going to know those four directors, probably.
Yeah, and they're revered to this day for their work.
Yeah.
I mean, they are legends.
Well, and that's part of the argument is the new era hasn't ended because Coppola and Scorsese are still making those kinds of movies to this day.
Yeah.
So,
well, I was thinking about Scorsese because he puts out some good movies.
yeah.
Do I like everybody that he puts in them? Casting's always kind of iffy, right? But
Yeah.
I'm always captivated by his films, honestly.
Yeah. Even if they're hard to watch, there's something about the fact that this man can do Taxi Driver and then The Age of Innocence blows my mind.
Oh, I just got chills. Yeah, you're right.
And so all of these guys are also best friends. They all went to college together. They started production companies together. So it kind of makes sense that they're right at the center of this new movement. It all came at an era that was the perfect timing for the big switch that came. Because cinema before this was pretty different.
Yeah.
There's kind of two ways to look at it, right? There's what was going on in cinema, and then there's what's going on in history, socially in the country. Those two things have like a big impact on what's going on.
A lot.
Yeah. It's a lot.
I mean, even like globally intertwined a lotness.
Yes. And this, what we're talking about is American cinema. There's other forms of cinema going on in France, Italy. You know, there's like neorealism, there's Russian cinema, Chinese cinema, all this stuff. We're just talking about American cinema with this. So I'll give you like a really quick overview of cinema timeline.
Yeah, let's break it down.
So the first one is early cinema, which is like the silent era. So we all kind of know, you know, what that looked like. Then there's the golden age, which were talkies.
Yes.
But the big thing about the golden age was the studio was king. And they also,
Oh, yeah.
they owned the movie theaters as well. So, like, they would only screen their own movies. You weren't allowed to, like, make a movie and put it up in a cinema. That's not how it worked back then. After that was film noir, and that was, like, the 40s and 50s. Cold War era, so you can see why film noir is like kind of a big deal at that time. People were starting to get a little bit nervous and suspicious of the unknown. Then there's the era independent, or like the auteur time period, which is the 50s and 60s. Think Alfred Hitchcock.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Yeah. And then New Wave begins. And New Wave, New Hollywood, it's the same era. They have a couple different names for it, but New Hollywood begins in the like mid to late 60s. After that comes the blockbusters, right?
Right.
And so think Spielberg, you know, blockbuster movies.
Yeah.
So there's and we're still kind of in superhero blockbuster now, but nowadays it feels like
I feel like it's waning a little bit.
It is waning, and there's also like New Wave is still exists now in a lot of independent movies. Mm-hmm. Part of why New Wave could start is because there was like a big shift happening in the movie industry. There was actually a Supreme Court hearing that made it so...
No way.
Yeah, it was like a big deal. They ruled in 1948, United States versus Paramount. It was a decision that broke up the studio conglomerate. So now cinemas could film anything, or they could show anything, which meant foreign movies.
Yes.
Think about it. You weren't seeing foreign films before because the studios would only show what they made, which is like, my brain is like, you can't even process that now because there's so much.
It's crazy.
We have access to everything now.
We do, and everything's influenced by the other thing in another place.
Exactly.
Like, it's kind of crazy. You're right.
So like what's going on in Europe, there is like this neo-realism, and it's really gritty. And it's post-World War. So now that's suddenly coming into America, and we've never seen that kind of stuff before. Then there was also a dissolution of the Motion Picture Production Code in 1968, and that was like guidelines of what is and isn't allowed on screen.
Oh, interesting.
Think about everything before the 1960s. There's no nudity. The violence is very minimal. Right. The way people talk to each other, the way they were allowed to address certain issues, you just don't see it before that.
Well, that was kind of a sign of that time too. Just kind of keep it buttoned up.
Yes.
Don't let anything too controversial out. I mean, what could be deemed controversial
exactly
at the time.
Although you know, there's all sorts of stuff that we look back at now and we're like, oh my God, that's so inappropriate, but they didn't see it that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Ooh. What was appropriate and inappropriate then is wild.
Yes. Oh my God. Just
some of the shit that was let through. Anyway.
Yeah. Just watch Birth of a Nation if you're not sure. Like, it was all considered very glitzy, but it was also considered very conservative, and not in a political sense, in a like morally conservative way. Right.
Right.
In the 60s, that starts to shift. But it also starts to shift. Like, people are sick of seeing that kind of stuff because it doesn't ring true to them anymore in the 60s. Because by then, we've had World War II and we've had the Korean War and the Cold War. But then it starts to get very active socially in the United States. And a lot of, like, very upsetting, heartbreaking stuff happens all close together, right? The civil rights movement starts in the 50s and goes on well into, you know, we could say now.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Kennedy is assassinated in 1963. The U.S. is involved in Vietnam from like the 50s, but they really up what they're doing in Vietnam in 1965. MLK is assassinated in 1968. A few months later, his brother Robert is Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother, is assassinated in 1968. They're all the civil rights people, you know, basically these very prominent figures fighting for civil rights get assassinated. And then there's the Watergate scandal that begins in 1972, right? So all this shit happens.
Right.
And the American public becomes disillusioned, very cynical, and they no longer trust the government. I don't know.
Y'all didn't see what I just did with my face. Like, wow, does that sound familiar? Oh.
The thing is, that sentiment has never shifted back. Think World War II, right? Like everyone was like, the government said buy bonds, and they did. They wanted to support what we were doing and support our troops and all this stuff. After the 60s, no one believed the government had their best interests at heart anymore.
Right.
Oh, and the draft.
And then,
the draft started in the 60s also.
The draft. Don't forget television. They're now broadcasting that they never broadcasted before, or at least visually.
Yes.
And a lot of that can't be censored quite as much.
Yeah.
You know, when, let's say, Challenger blows up, you know, and people are watching. And,
right, it's live.
What's his face? Nixon gets on there and makes a fool of himself. And, you know.
And all the bodies coming back from Vietnam, they showed it.
Can't ignore that, yeah. And the 70s, I was not alive. I can't speak to it. But the 70s marked a transitory phase, like you said, where the disillusionment and I hate to say rebellion, but music changed, clothing.
It was the birth of
that
counterculture
started in the 60s.
In the 60s, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so then that carried into the 80s very much so. Mm-hmm. And
on
it goes.
Until Ronald Reagan. And it all changed in like yuppieism and all that. So there's like a pretty distinct shift that happens even there. So this is like a really interesting period where some of the culture still bleeds over, but there's also a bigger division happening there. But that's a whole other story for a different day.
We're talking about movies after all.
Yeah, exactly. But this was always something that my professors asked. Does art reflect history? Does history reflect art? Right?
Oh, well, yes. The answer's yes.
Exactly. Like it's a chicken or the egg. It's like it's both.
Back to the Renaissance.
Yes, 100%.
Even before, there was religious and socio things going on that literally drove art, and art drove the socio-economic, religious, political, everything.
100%.
It's not rare.
Yeah.
So.
And cinema is no different, and it has a further reach than like a painting on a wall. Cinema can reach a lot of people all over the world now in seconds. Back then, of course, it had to be shipped in a can.
That's still so cool, though. There's nothing better than the tick, 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 tick of an old film, you know?
I know. It just, like, the saturation on film is so different than digital. But now, you know, there's AI can do all sorts of But
right.
Okay, so you see the historical context. Here's what a new Hollywood film is, right? It has gritty subject matter, which is going to be like war, violence, crime, prostitution, adultery. These are subject matters that were maybe touched on in Golden Era, but not this way.
Right.
It's inventive, dynamic, and documentary-style cinematography. So think of like an old Gene Kelly movie. It kind of felt like one camera filming a stage.
Yeah.
Now there's like moving cameras, and George Lucas and Spielberg invented a lot of technology for how they use cranes and helicopters and all sorts of crazy shit.
And those things that are on like an almost a train track,
the dolly.
Like a track, and it follows. Yeah, that's so cool how they film some scenes like that. It's amazing.
And they use rack focus while they do that, which takes a lot of skill. Scorsese does this amazing trombone shot in Goodfellas. It's super famous. Everybody knows it if they've seen the movie. It's where the people hold still, but the scenery around them rack focuses, so it looks like you're zooming up a hallway at them. It's awesome. I think it's awesome. Imagine being at the forefront of this and it being like the first wave of its kind.
And then I don't know what it's like to invent anything, but to be that creative.
Yeah.
To think, to take the courage to try something different.
Yeah, it was.
I think that's fantastic.
Different. Think about it, think of your grandparents, what they were going to see the movies, and then your parents, their movies.
That's true.
It was so shocking to the older generation to see stuff like this because it was so realistic in some senses that it was borderline very upsetting to people.
Oh yeah, I could see that. Yeah,
and I mean, watch Taxi Driver. It's upsetting, but it's very well made, but I never want to see it again.
No. It's so good and so impactful. Once is enough.
Yes, exactly. And then there's cynicism and there's less moralizing. A great example is Taxi Driver. Robert De Niro plays Travis Bickle, the main character, and he does horrific shit. Really super upsetting stuff. It's a very upsetting subject matter. The movie does not take a stance on whether it's right or wrong.
Right. Yeah.
And that's very common in this time period. So it's gritty, it's it's kind of like Baroquism, which is misshapen pearl. It's like the ugliest parts of life, but not judging it.
Just putting it out there to view.
Yeah.
For strange entertainment.
And like,
But it's an art piece. It's taking realistic stuff
yeah.
and putting it in front of large groups of people for the first time, which I think that would be so cool to be there for one of those. Like the first time.
It was
you know,
groundbreaking.
you ever see something like that.
Exactly. It's what we've talked about before, where you want to see yourself reflected in art. And people were so cynical at that time because of everything happening politically and socially that a big, jolly Hollywood movie felt really insincere. And they were getting kind of sick of it as a society. And so to see this stuff that's super gritty felt more realistic to how they felt. They felt afraid of the draft and afraid of like the social and political violence because there were more protests that ended violently, stuff like that. You know, students got shot in Ohio, stuff like that. So some movies that were very famous from this era were Bonnie and Clyde, which I told you, it's kind of like one of the first movies. And that movie was super bloody.
It was.
It's so violent. And it's 1968.
Right out the gate.
Yeah, like, holy shit, that ending was crazy. Easy Rider also. It was all about counterculture, which came out the next year. It was 1969. Counterculture, sex, drugs. They took drugs in the movie, which they never showed that shit before. And then there was like a whole sequence of experimental surrealism. And it won like an Oscar.
Yeah.
It is so upsetting. The subject matter, super upsetting.
At least they were recognized for their groundbreakingness.
Yeah, it was a big deal at the time. Now, if you watch that movie, you'd probably laugh out loud because it's just like hippies riding motorcycles. But
yeah, but it should be respected for what it was at the time.
It was a big deal.
That kind of stuff. You can't compare it to today. There's no comparison because of the time period.
Exactly. You can laugh at stuff, but if you put it in context, you'll realize it was actually kind of a big deal. There was also like The French Connection, which everybody's heard about, Taxi Driver, The Godfather, Dog Day Afternoon. Yeah. What do all these movies have in common? Not a single one has a happy ending.
No, not a single. Of the ones that you listed that I've watched, not a single one has. No, and actually there's ambiguity in the characters themselves.
Yes.
They might be good, they might be bad, they have good intentions but do bad things.
Exactly. Yep. George Lucas is on this list, but not for Star Wars. His contribution is American Graffiti. And I would say it has a happier ending. Again,
I haven't seen it, but I know the ending. So I don't want to comment too much, but I know how it ends.
The main character is like trying to decide if he's going to go away to college or not. And one of them decides to, and one of them decides not to.
What's right, what's wrong.
Right. And there's no like real judgment on which is the right thing to do.
Even to this day, that's kind of a theme.
Yes. One
path is no better than the other, really, if it's you.
It's what that character wanted, you know? So like.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So I would say George's contribution is one of the more cheery ones, but his other, like, what was it? I can't remember the numbers now. It's the number of that stormtrooper. He used it in his original, like, sci-fi short movie that he made with Robert Duvall. I can't remember now.
Oh, man, I feel like I should know this.
I
don't know.
I can't remember it now because I haven't looked it up recently, but that was way more depressing. That was like Brave New World depressing. At this time, gone are the days of wrapping everything up in a nice, neat bow. This era is way more interested in showing the irony of getting what you want, or like the way society doesn't give a shit about you, how you can become invisible in the world and the bad guy might win even though the good guy tried really hard. So how does Star Wars fit into this? It comes out in 1977. It's right in the middle of this era. It kind of sits on the line, right, of...
We have to think about episode 4 only.
Right,
Because
exactly.
there was no intention of the others coming out,
Yeah,
right?
he had
At
no
least.
idea that was even going to happen. So he's just...
So,
yeah.
just A New Hope.
Yeah, exactly. And it does deal with these subject matters, right? War,
It does.
resistance, large evil that's overwhelming, censorship, economic hardship. I mean, Han Solo is so perfect in this era. He is the new Hollywood man,
He is.
you know?
Yeah, he really is.
And it's kind of amazing to me that George Lucas makes a movie with a happy ending in the middle of this era. Because like no other movie was like that at the time.
Yeah, with such large figures
Yeah.
in this movie. Like very obvious bad guys, very obvious good guys. You know, space in general.
Yes, right? Like no one else is making surreal.
What have we had?
and this...
Star Trek?
Yeah.
We've had Star Trek up to this point,
Right.
which was walking in from stage left, stage right, into frame. Cutscene, new stage, like,
Foam
and I'm not
rock.
knocking it. Yeah. Foam, green alien, like, it's loved and revered. And my mom would speak to this. She's a giant Trekkie,
Yeah.
you know, and that opened the door. But like, space wasn't common. We got every movie that you listed here was down on planet Earth,
Yeah.
with just humans being terrible and maybe sometimes not.
Not happy endings.
Yeah. And here we have these guys with shiny, I'm trying not to describe them as lightsabers. They like they're laser swords. Hey. And guys in black capes. Hey. And, you know.
Right? Like it doesn't fit in with all the other stuff that's going on in this time period of cinema.
The reception it got, you know, the hordes of people that went to see
Yeah.
A New Hope, you know. And the title alone is kind of out of this.
Yeah.
It has the word hope in it, you know?
When I wonder too,
That was odd.
maybe it's because people were so tired at this point because New Hollywood started in the late 60s. Now this is the late 70s. It's like maybe they were ready for happy movies to come back.
Or something to take them out of, something that wasn't so totally beyond what they could connect to, because we're still dealing with like real world topics, even if it's set in space.
Yeah.
And the space, the moon landing, all of that had already happened. So it wasn't too far out of, you know, maybe this will be the future. Like maybe someday we'll get to travel to a planet, you know, stuff like that. Like kids.
Yeah.
You know, I still kind of hope that we can go far away in spaceships. But at the same time, you have the sense of good guy, bad guy. Perhaps the good guy can win.
Yeah.
You know, perhaps not all hope is lost.
One,
That sort of thing.
the background, at least let's say Tatooine and some of the other ships, is very much New Hollywood in the sense that it's the future, but everything's run down.
Right. Yeah.
It's like what you've said about the rebellion too. It's like this ragtag group of people who kind of don't have equipment that works that well.
They're all kind of underground.
Yeah.
They're reusing stuff because they have to, and
Right.
got to get creative with some stuff sometimes. And
When I've read another theory too, which I don't remember if we've ever talked about it here on the show, but I know you and I have talked about it just a little bit together, that it's a reflection of the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War ended in 1975, and I've heard it described that the empire is America and the rebellion are the Vietnamese, and they're fighting this large empire that comes into their world. I mean,
sure.
the actual conflict is far more nuanced than that, and I'm not saying anything about that or passing judgment on it at all. It's not my area of expertise, but the idea that conflict going on in the real world might have had an influence on George Lucas is not
yeah.
a far-fetched idea, even though his symbolism is much more like Nazi symbolism with, you know, the empire outfits
Right.
and everything like that. But
The Chanel boots, yes.
yes, exactly. I love studying this kind of thing where you take like a film and you look at it in the era that it was created and how parts of it kind of, like, parts of Star Wars feel like new cinema, especially, or new Hollywood, especially with, like, the technology, the cinematography, some of the larger themes. But the fact that George Lucas wouldn't give in to the cynicism all the way, I think is actually kind of a beautiful thing. And he holds on to that, like, all the way through the prequels and everything.
He really does. And, I mean, there's a reason these films have stood the test of time with multiple age groups, eras of generations, you know, different iterations of characters, but, you know, throughout the same woven fabric of Star Wars. We keep coming back for a reason. We say it all the time here that Star Wars is pain. Lest we forget. But we keep coming back because, number one, it's real. It's real to us. Meaning, we feel connected to the that's in it.
Yeah.
That pain that's in there, we get it.
Yeah.
We actively seek it out in some ways because we're like that in this fandom. And then, in the end, we have characters we can cling to that give us hope or give us messages of hope that we carry through our real lives. I just got a sign for my office. Can you guess what it says?
I'm not sure which way you went.
It's a wooden sign. I got it on Etsy. Rebellions are built on hope. And I am looking at it every single day I'm in that office of mine. Mm-hmm. Every time I start to feel like everything's crumbling, I remember, well, the phrase of the rebellion, but Jin's words, Cassian's words, their words, you know?
Yeah.
Thank God for hope, because...
Yeah, I think we really need it.
Thank God for George Lucas for giving it to us and giving it to the people then, because they obviously really needed it after the of the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, leading all the way through on to today.
Well, maybe that can actually give us a little bit of calm, because I bet that generation felt pretty terrified also. And
it's very true.
I know
that's very true.
That my dad lived in fear of the draft being called up. His draft number was the next one gonna get called up when they finally canceled the draft.
Oh, I never knew that.
Yeah, and it's just like,
that's intense.
You know, that's a whole other level of fear that we don't have now, but we have our own that our parents' generation definitely wasn't dealing with. So let's just try to cling on to the George Lucas lesson of hope, and that if we can have our community and stay together, that we could maybe make it through some hardship. And that's, I think, why Star Wars is really successful, because, again, it has that theme of be careful what you wish for. Luke wants adventure, gets it, and ends up paying a huge price for it.
Totally.
And we kind of, I think we relate to that as humans, because life is hard. It's really difficult.
Yeah.
But then to have the story wrap up in a way where you're just like, oh, thank God.
Yes, right.
So I think that's what we needed. And I would say that's what society needed at the time, because the next era is called kind of the Good Morning era in the 1980s, where it's like, think of Indiana Jones, Star Wars, Back to the Future. We love these heroes that are kind of irreverent, but also really hearts of gold. You know, they got a heart of gold.
Yeah.
And that 1980s, and even into the 90s, like Jurassic Park, and then Independence Day, like all these movies that are big blockbusters. They make people feel something, like they can overcome something, you know.
I'm over here smiling because you just mentioned Independence Day. That film hit me hard when I was in 6th grade.
Yeah.
Man.
I think that Spielberg and Lucas were like founding fathers of the new Hollywood movement, but they're also the reason it ended. Like their shift and their production companies shifted people into a new state. Not everything, because like I said, there's still people making new Hollywood genre, but it allows us to all exist at the same time, which before that wasn't really possible. And I also feel like Star Wars in particular kind of combines Golden Age Hollywood with new Hollywood. So you get like the big glamour, glitzy, beautiful, and then this like gritty subject matter, and you mush it together and you get this space opera.
Yes. Yes. All my favorite elements, really.
So that's my spiel. Thank you for letting me rant on about it, but yeah.
I honestly, I find it fascinating. I didn't know the names of all of these different eras, and I didn't know that the 80s was the good morning. Is there a reason for that?
I don't think it's an official name. It's more of like the blockbuster era, but yes, they say the quote it's quoted as good morning era because of Ronald Reagan, actually.
Oh, okay. All right.
And it has to do with the golden age of America and like America for Americans and all that stuff. So
wah, wah. I get it.
So like
moving on.
I mean, it's impossible to say that politics and art aren't interconnected. They absolutely are, and politics drives social stuff drives politics, and it all influences art one way or another.
Since the dawn of time, really.
Yes, and it's way more comfortable to be looking back at it in history than to be living through it, but it is what it is. And
that's probably what every generation said, though.
Exactly.
And so maybe 40 years from now, the filmmakers will look back on whatever the this is and have a talk about it in a history class.
They have all these like superhero universes going on?
It's the multiverse.
We needed
the multiverse of the multiverse. You don't understand. We had to have 50 things going on at once. That's what everybody was about back then. Never-ending multitasking, including superheroes. No wonder we're exhausted. All right, our question for you this week is, if you were an original 1977 New Hope viewer, if you were in the audience and you knew the hype leading up to A New Hope, and you're in this age of cinema that Lauren and I just discussed, what was your initial feelings going into seeing it? Like, what drove you to go see it? Were you feeling any of the emotions that Lucas and company were trying to either create or recreate in a different way? Yeah. Tell us. We want to know because we weren't there and we wish we were.
All right, next time we are going to dive into one of Leanne's passion subjects. And I'm really excited to talk about this because as fanfic writers, we have... As fanfic writers, we've both had to do research on this. We're going to talk about ships in Star Wars, and it's going to be awesome.
We're going to discuss, like, the innards of the different ships.
Yeah.
And, like, where was the mess hall? Where did they get changed? Did they have showers? How does this work? Where did Vader sleep? Oh, wait. He didn't.
Nope.
Nope. He had nightmares and then floated in some weird liquid. So, anyway, where was that kept on a ship? We'll let you know. Let's talk ship about Star Wars.
Ha ha.
Nyuk, 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 nyuk.
On the last episode, we discussed Obi-Wan Kenobi, because that's what this show is about. And we were talking about our favorite moments from the Kenobi series, and Charles Z sent me this message saying, I can tell you that my immediate response to my key standout scene is the scene where he puts his hand on the back of the door and you can see him reaching out and reading Reva and working out what's going on and being the wise negotiator. As soon as he puts his hand on the door, you saw this change in his demeanor and his emotions, and I audibly said, there he is.
Oh, there he is. Oh, that's good. Yeah.
I was like, yeah, it's a really good moment because it is him, like,
it is
suddenly allowing himself to use the Force to read the moment, and he's putting all the hints together to realize who she is. I did love that moment. And then he's like,
yeah, that's a good one.
You're not bringing me to him, I'm bringing him to you. That moment. It's like,
yeah, that is good. Yeah. That's a good moment.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone who sent your favorite Obi-Wan moments in. There are too many to list. That is the general consensus from all our listeners.
Yeah. Basically all of them. And thank you so much for joining us here on the Most Things Kenobi podcast. We appreciate every single one of our patrons and are grateful for your support. If you'd like to support the podcast and become a patron as well, head over to the Most Things Kenobi Patreon. As always, you can follow us on Tumblr, Instagram, YouTube, and Threads, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast player. If you enjoy our podcasts, feel free to rate us on Spotify and Apple. And if you need one place to find all of these, head over to mostthingsKenobi.com.
So until next time, my space twin, may the force be with you.
Always.